Are you trying to be funny? Yeah. I know. I'm sorry. I'm sorry to destabilize everybody. Yeah. Yeah. Great. All right. Good afternoon. Have a couple of. I'll start off with a couple of statements. The first one on Sri Lanka. The Secretary General welcomes the resolution of the political crisis in Sri Lanka through peaceful constitutional means and applauds the resilience of the country's democratic institutions. The Secretary General calls on all political actors to seize the opportunity of the appointment of the new cabinet to resolve outstanding political differences in the same spirit of respect for democracy and in the interest of the people of Sri Lanka. And that statement is now online. And I have two senior appointments to tell you. Today, the Secretary General is appointing Karen Smith of South Africa as a special advisor on the responsibility to protect. She will succeed Ivan Simonovic of Croatia, to whom the Secretary General is deeply grateful. Mr. Smith will work under the overall guidance of Adama Dieng, the Secretary General's special advisor on the prevention of genocide. Mr. Smith is currently a lecturer of international relations at the Institute for History at Leiden University in the Netherlands. Miss Smith, excuse me. And the Secretary General is also appointing Maria Francesca Spatolisano of Italy as the Assistant Secretary General for Policy Coordination and Interagency Affairs in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. She will succeed Thomas Gass of Switzerland, to whom the Secretary General is grateful for his commitment and dedicated service to the organization. Ms. Spatolisano has 33 years of experience in public service, including senior leadership in multilateral affairs. And in his final briefing to the Security Council, a special envoy for Syria, Stéphane de Mistura, said that the agreement to halt fighting in Idlib has held so far, but he added that we have never had for any length of time a nationwide ceasefire or confidence-building measures that has been asked in Resolution 2254. The special envoy said that since Sochi, he has been undergoing a marathon of consultations to enable the creation of a credible, balanced, Syrian-owned and Syrian-led constitutional committee. He said that in recent weeks, diplomacy beyond the UN Secretariat has intensified. And he detailed the recent developments, which he said would leave him with the confidence that there's been real progress, although that he added that we need to go an extra mile in order to have a list of names for the Constitutional Committee. He offered his successor, Geir Peterson, all the success in his vital work and ended his briefing by shaking hands with all members of the Security Council. And he thanked him for their support over the years. Mr. de Mistura has promised to go to the stakeout, and he will honor that promise, and that should be probably, if my estimate is right, in about half an hour or so, but we'll let you know. On the humanitarian front, we remain concerned about the ongoing hostilities in the southern Idlib governorate in Syria, with reports of civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure. Between late November and December 12th, over 18,500 women and children and men were reportedly displaced, with the vast majority moving within Idlib governorate. Initial food and non-food items have been provided by local humanitarian partners. The new displacement comes on top of the more than 1 million women and children and men facing long-term displacement in the governorate, many of them having been displaced multiple times. The UN continues to urge all parties to respect their obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. And in a new UN report that further underscores what our guests here said yesterday at the briefing, migrants and refugees are subject to unimaginable horrors from the moment they enter Libya, during their stay there, and if they manage to make it that far during any attempts to cross the Mediterranean Sea. The joint report of the UN mission in Libya, the UN Human Rights Office, details violations, including unlawful killing, tortures, gang rape, and slavery committed by state officials, armed groups, smugglers, and traffickers. The report says that Libya cannot be considered a place of safety following rescue or interception at sea. It also notes that the policies of the European Union and its member states to curb the ability of migrants and refugees to reach Europe have contributed to trapping thousands of desperate people in Libya. And on Cameroon, our humanitarian colleagues there tell us that the needs have been growing steadily in the southwest and northwest region of the country, with insecurity leading to nearly 440,000 people being internally displaced. Aid workers are ramping up their response, but are impeded by a lack of funding. As of last month, only 35% of the $15.2 million needed for the crisis at southwest and northwest have been provided. As of today, only 39% of the 2018 humanitarian response plan for Cameroon, only 39% of the $318 million needed have been funded, making it one of the lowest funded emergencies. And the World Food Program said today it reached 5 million people in the Democratic Republic of the Congo this year. This is double the number of people reached last year. WFP significantly expanded its operations in the country due to the widening violence and displacement, poor harvest, and endemic poverty. The UN agency scaled up its intervention in the eastern province of Ituri, Tanganyika, and North and South Kivu, where flaring conflicts forced many more people from their homes. Assistance was provided in the form of commodities, cash, and especially fortified foods for the treatment and prevention of acute malnutrition, which affects 4.6 million children countrywide. More information on WFP's website. And just lastly, yesterday, the Security Council held an open meeting on drug trafficking in West and Central Africa. Yuri Fedotov, the executive director of the UN Drugs and Crime Office, briefed and said that new and alarming trends in drug trafficking have been registered in the region with disruptive and destabilizing effects on governance, security, economic growth, and public health. He said that post-conflict states and states in transition, including Guinea-Bissau, require greater ambition to address drug and organized crime challenges. And after we are done, my guest here will be Ibrahim Thiaw, the Special Advisor of the Secretary General on the Sahel. And he will brief you on the situation in the Sahel. Sayyid Rais.
Thank you, Sayyid Rais.
I apologize for starting earlier than my usual lateness, which I understood took people by surprise.
People not accustomed to that.
I know.
You're spoiling us.
Yeah.
Stéphane, I'm sure you're well aware of the intense negotiation and talks on the UK-Yemen draft that's taking place, trying to pass it by tomorrow. First of all, to give the monitors a mandate and also to enshrine the agreements in Stockholm that were not signed by the parties before they leave.
They were agreed to.
Agreed, but not signed.
Okay.
It's a fact. But my question really is concerning the draft, the UK draft. How important is it for the SG to name violators of the United Nations resolution? And I'm speaking here about violation of arm embargo, for example, which is very destabilizing for Yemen. And of course, here I'm speaking about Iran.
The question.
How important, the question is, how important is to the SG to name violators such as Iran with this destabilizing effect of arms smuggling to the Houthis in a draft?
Okay. Our understanding is that the reference to Iran has now been removed.
What's the position of the SG?
I will leave it at that. Obviously, the Security Council is master of its work, and I've just shared with you our understanding. James.
If I could have a follow-up question on that, and then I have a question on Syria. But on Yemen, how important, given that you're trying to get monitors there, that you have this deal, it's a bit fragile, how important is it to the SG that something is passed as soon as possible?
A resolution, as we've always said, is very important to us to back the work that Mr. Griffiths has successfully concluded in Stockholm.
Can I ask the Syria question?
Why not?
In terms of what we heard from Mr. de Mistura, clearly there was an important meeting in Geneva earlier this week. The Russians, Foreign Minister Lavrov, came up with a list of 17 new names. Can you tell us how involved the Secretary General was in that process in Geneva? Did he have phone calls with Foreign Minister Lavrov? How would you characterize those phone calls? Was there an angry row between the two?
The Secretary General as always in these processes with Mr. de Mistura, Mr. Griffiths gets involved when his envoys feel he needs to get involved for that final push, or when he himself feels he needs to get involved. There were phone conversations with various foreign ministers, and I think the outcome of the process was exactly how Mr. de Mistura described it, where we were thankful for the efforts put forward, and I think, as he said again today, that there was an extra mile to go to. I'm not in the habit of characterizing the nature of or the tone of the phone calls, but the Secretary General is is always a very calm and level person, as you know.
Thank you, Stéphane. I have two questions. The first one is both of them about Syria. Any reaction from Secretary General for the U.S. decision to withdraw its forces from Syria? And the second question is, giving this major upcoming military development, there might be a Turkish military campaign. Now there are threats from Syrian part and ISIS on those areas in northeast Syria. Hundreds of thousands of people are fearing for their life. Is there any preparation by the UN for a possible humanitarian disaster very soon?
The UN's team in Syria is always watching the situation very closely, prepositions aid as it needs to, and is always. I mean, sadly, they have a lot of experience. Okay. In this area, so we are ready to respond to whatever further aid and further crisis there is. I'm not going to comment on military decisions taken by one member state or another. What is important for us is the peace process, or the efforts of Mr. de Mistura, and any efforts. Military efforts to combat extremist groups such as Daesh or others, it is important that all the parties take the utmost care in protecting civilians and protecting civilian infrastructure so as not to add to the already horrendous suffering of the Syrian civilians.
But there are now preparation for a military campaign. When there was a preparation for military campaign, for example, in Eastern Ghouta, the Secretary General himself came out and spoke about this concern. Why not talk about this development
we're watching,
now?
I think I've kind of answered the question. We're obviously watching the developments very closely. Yes, sir, and then go ahead, Evelyn.
Thank you, Mr. Stéphane. A ruling authority of Bangladesh cracked down on opposition candidates and their supporters. Now, fair and credible election is beyond the imagination, even as one of the election commissioners also warned that level playing field is not there. Is Secretary General aware of that situation, and what initiatives he is going to take to reflect the will of Bangladeshi people on December 30th?
We are following the situation closely, and it is very important, as a matter of principle, that anywhere there are elections, that they be conducted freely and fairly, and that the space be given for people to express themselves. Evelyn.
Yes, after Mr. de Mistura spoke, several council members mentioned the Constitutional Committee had to be balanced. Is it balanced now, or was it
I think Mr.
balanced?
I think Mr. de Mistura preemptively answered that question, and he will be delighted to take your questions in a few minutes. So instead of hearing from someone who speaks for him, you can hear from him directly. Sir, and then Linda.
Okay. Just another follow-up question on Syria. Do you have any knowledge if the United States informed Mr. de Mistura or the UN by their move to get out of Syria? And will the United Nations play any role in ground to take over the areas where the U.S. will vacate?
Well, we're not an armed party in this conflict, so it is not for the UN to take over, quote unquote, take over area that one military or another may vacate. I'm not aware that we were given any notice to the announcement. Linda.
Thank you, Steph. This is in regard to Ukraine. I was wondering, given the sort of maritime disputes between Russia and Ukraine, is there any role that the UN is playing, and specifically, has the SG been in contact with either party?
I'm not aware of any role that we're actively playing on the issue, on the broader issue between Ukraine and Russia. We've been very supportive of the Minsk process and continue to do so. Yes, in the back.
Thank you. Some months ago, Netanyahu stood next to a nuclear bomb factory and threatened Iran with annihilation. Some days ago, he openly boasted about his offensive missiles that can reach anywhere. Do you have any position about this clear threat of security?
I have to take a look at those comments and I will get back to you. Mr. Bays and then Mr. Kay.
There have been widespread protests in a country where I know the UN takes a lot of interest, Sudan, not just in Khartoum, but around the country. In the past, as you know, there have been crackdowns, there have been human rights violations. What is given this widespread feeling on the streets of Sudanese cities, what is the message from the United Nations to the Sudanese government on how to handle these protests?
It's important that people be given the right to demonstrate and express themselves freely and peacefully. Majid.
Just follow up on your statement. You said we are watching the situation closely, but there's a threat of a military campaign. Why there is no call for calm that you usually have in situations
I think that
like
was
that
reflected in Mr. de Mistora's comments, and I think in terms of what I said yesterday, that we are not for increased military action. We are for increased effort on the peace front.
About OCHA, one question.
Yes, sure.
There are questions on through social media, actually, from the civilians in that area of where to run, run away, and which access they should take, which route to escape those areas if that military action happens. I'm talking about northeastern Syria. Is there any recommendation by OCHA to where the civilians should go?
I don't want to. I don't want to add. I don't want to say anything at this point. I think what is important is that obviously, with all the people living in that area, the hundreds of thousands of people, that any military activity, as I've already said, not put the safety and protection of civilians at risk. We're dealing in most parts of Syria not only with sort of civilian population that lives in an area, but people who've already been displaced once, twice, if not more, and we remain concerned about the threat of any military activity. Okay, I will get our guest if you don't mind staying, and I'll be right back.